I've lived in HOA neighborhoods long enough to know there are two kinds of people: the ones who treat the rules like a simple agreement between neighbors, and the ones who treat them like a holy book carved into stone tablets. Unfortunately for me, my neighborhood had one of the second kind, a woman named Denise Carter. Now, that wasn't her real name, but trust me, if you've ever lived under an HOA, you already know exactly who I'm talking about. Denise was the self-appointed sheriff of the subdivision. She always had a clipboard tucked under one arm, a phone in the other hand, and an expression that suggested she believed she was personally responsible for preserving civilization. Every week somebody got an email about their mailbox, their lawn, their trash cans, or some other microscopic offense that apparently threatened the future of humanity. I mostly stayed out of her way. I paid my dues, kept my property clean, waved at neighbors, and minded my own business. My garage, though, seemed to fascinate her. Every time I opened it, even for a few minutes, I would catch her staring from across the street. Sometimes she'd slow down during her evening walks and linger just a little too long. Once she actually asked me, "What exactly do you keep in there?" I laughed and told her the truth. Too many expensive hobbies. She didn't laugh back. Looking back now, that should have been my warning sign. The whole thing exploded on a Monday afternoon. I was about 20 minutes away from home picking up supplies when my phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again. Then again. I glanced down at a stoplight and saw 3 messages from my neighbor, Mike. The first one read, "Call me ASAP." The second one said, "You're not going to believe this." The third one made my stomach drop straight into my shoes. "Denise is inside your garage." For a second, I thought he meant she was standing outside, looking through a window, or maybe peeking through a crack. Then I called him. He answered immediately. "No," he said before I could even ask. "I mean inside. She somehow got her garage open and she's walking around in there." My heart started pounding. My garage wasn't just a place where I parked my truck. It was my sanctuary. It held decades of work, thousands of hours of restoration projects, and a collection I'd spent most of my adult life building. Some items were valuable. Some were fragile. Some were completely irreplaceable. The thought of someone wandering around in there without permission made my blood boil. I turned the truck around and headed home faster than I probably should admit. The entire drive, my mind kept racing. Had something been damaged? Had something been stolen? How had she even gotten in? By the time I reached my street, I could see people standing outside. That's never a good sign. Neighbors were gathered in little clusters near their driveways, pretending not to watch while very obviously watching. Then I saw Denise's SUV parked in front of my house. My pulse jumped again. I pulled into my driveway, jumped out of the truck, and headed straight toward the garage. The side door was open. The moment I stepped inside, I found Denise standing right in the middle of the room. She had her clipboard. She had her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. And she looked completely comfortable, like she belonged there. She didn't even seem embarrassed that she'd been caught. She glanced up and said, "Oh good, you're home." Like she was doing me a favor. I stared at her for a second because my brain genuinely struggled to process what I was seeing. "What are you doing in my garage?" I asked. Denise sighed dramatically. "I'm conducting an inspection." "An inspection. Not a visit. Not a misunderstanding. An inspection. You broke into my property," I said. "No," she replied, waving her hand dismissively. "I entered because several residents have raised concerns about possible violations." Several residents. That was HOA Karen language for I made it up. I could feel my jaw tightening. "You had absolutely no right to come in here." But Denise wasn't listening anymore. She was already looking around again, scribbling notes on her clipboard like she was documenting a crime scene. Then she pointed toward the back section of the garage and said, "What exactly are you hiding back there?" And that's when I realized something. Denise had spent months building a fantasy in her head. She genuinely believed she was about to uncover some massive HOA violation. Maybe she imagined piles of junk. Maybe she thought I was running a secret repair business. Maybe she expected to find evidence that would finally justify all her obsession. What she didn't know was that she was about to walk directly into the biggest shock of her life. Because the next thing she saw wasn't a violation. It was the result of 30 years of passion, patience, and hard work. And within minutes, The woman who strutted into my garage like an all-powerful HOA enforcer would be sitting on my concrete floor staring at it in complete disbelief. Before I tell you what happened next, let me pause the story for a second, because this is where things get interesting from both a legal and psychological standpoint. According to standard procedure, an HOA can enforce community rules, but that authority is not unlimited. Most people don't realize that HOA representatives generally cannot just walk on a private property and start conducting surprise inspections whenever they feel like it. From a legal perspective, entering someone's locked garage without permission can create serious liability issues, especially if property gets damaged or someone gets hurt. But honestly, the legal side wasn't even the most fascinating part to me. The real story was what was happening inside Denise's head. This is a psychological trap that shows up whenever someone becomes obsessed with control. The longer a person believes they're always right, the harder it becomes for them to accept information that contradicts their assumptions. Denise had already convinced herself that I was hiding something suspicious. In her mind, she wasn't investigating a possibility anymore. She was hunting for proof of a conclusion she'd already reached. And as you're about to see, reality was about to hit her a lot harder than any HOA policy ever could. Denise was still standing there with that clipboard in her hand when I walked past her and hit the switch that raised the main garage door all the way. Sunlight flooded the room, and suddenly everything inside was impossible to ignore. For a few seconds, she didn't say a word. The woman who always seemed to have an opinion about everything just froze. Along the left wall sat 6 vintage motorcycles, each one restored to factory condition, chrome shining under the lights like mirrors. Along the back wall were 3 classic cars that had taken me years to rebuild. One of them had spent nearly a decade in pieces before I finally got it running again. To the right stood custom display cabinets filled with rare collectibles, first edition comic books, action figures still sealed in original packaging, signed sports memorabilia, antique advertising signs, and dozens of historical pieces I'd spent years tracking down at auctions and estate sales across multiple states. Everything was organized. Everything was documented. Everything was insured. It looked less like a garage and more like a private museum. Denise blinked several times. "What?" she whispered. Then she looked around again. "What is all this?" I crossed my arms. "My hobbies." Her eyes moved from one motorcycle to another, then to the classic cars, then to the display cases. I could practically see her brain struggling to process what she was seeing. She had expected garbage. She had expected violations. She had expected some secret mess that would justify her obsession. Instead, she had discovered something that completely destroyed the story she'd been telling herself for months. She took a step backward, then another. "This can't be right," she said quietly. "Why would somebody have all this?" I almost laughed. "Because I enjoy it." The answer seemed to frustrate her even more. Denise wasn't looking at the collection the way normal people would. Most people would have seen craftsmanship, dedication, and history. Denise saw something else. She saw evidence that she had been wrong. And for people who build their identity around being right, that could be surprisingly difficult to handle. She started walking through the garage faster now, desperately searching for something she could criticize. "These motorcycles take up too much space," she announced. "It's a garage," I replied. "That's where vehicles usually go." A few neighbors who had gathered outside started chuckling. Denise ignored them. She pointed toward one of the display cabinets. "These toys look excessive. They're collectibles." Same thing. Not according to their market value. That comment earned another laugh from outside. Her face turned red. The more she searched, the worse things got. Every shelf was clean. Every item was properly stored. Every restoration project had paperwork. Every vehicle was registered. There was literally nothing for her to write down. Yet she kept flipping through pages on her clipboard, as if a violation might magically appear if she looked hard enough. Then came the moment nobody in the neighborhood would ever forget. Denise stopped in front of a rare motorcycle I'd spent almost 4 years restoring. She stared at it for several seconds. Her mouth opened slightly. Then she looked around the room one more time. That's when her knees seemed to wobble. At first I thought she had simply lost her balance. Then she actually sat down on the concrete floor. Not gracefully, not intentionally. She just sort of collapsed into a seated position while staring at everything around her. The entire garage went silent. One neighbor, standing near the driveway, whispered, "Is she okay?" Another answered, "I think her brain just rebooted." Honestly, that wasn't far from the truth. Denise looked genuinely overwhelmed. "I don't understand," she muttered. "I thought." She stopped herself. "I already knew how that sentence ended. I thought you were breaking the rules. I thought you were hiding something. I thought I was going to catch you." Except none of those things were true. She spent months imagining herself as the hero of a story that only existed inside her own head. Now reality had arrived with a wrecking ball. After a minute, she slowly stood up again and tried to regain control of the situation. "Well," she said, straightening her shirt, "some of these items may still be aesthetically inconsistent with community standards." There it was, the desperate reach, the last attempt to salvage authority. I nodded thoughtfully. "Show me the rule." She blinked. "What?" "Show me the rule." "The rule." "The HOA rule that says collectible motorcycles are prohibited." She flipped through her papers. "Nothing." "Show me the rule that bans classic cars stored inside a private garage." More page flipping. "Nothing." "Show me the rule that limits comic books." Silence. By now, several neighbors had moved closer. Denise knew she was losing the audience. People weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at her. For years, she had operated from a position of social intimidation. Most homeowners simply complied because arguing wasn't worth the headache. But intimidation only works when people believe you actually have authority. Once that illusion cracks, everything changes. Denise finally pointed at one of the cars and said, "I just feel like this is excessive." I smiled. Good thing feelings aren't HOA regulations. Somebody outside laughed so hard they nearly dropped their coffee. Denise looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. Eventually, I escorted her toward the exit. "This inspection is over," I said. "It never should have started." She opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to realize she had absolutely no ground left to stand on. Without another word, she walked outside and headed toward her SUV. The story could have ended there, but honestly, that was only the beginning. The moment she left, I started making phone calls. First, I reviewed my security footage. Then I contacted the HOA board directly. Unlike Denise, the actual board members understood liability. The moment they heard that someone had entered private property without authorization, they became very interested. I submitted the footage, witness statement from neighbors, timestamps, and a written summary of everything that had happened. Within days, an emergency board meeting was scheduled. Denise apparently arrived expecting support. Instead, she got questions. Lots of questions. Why had she entered the property? Who authorized the inspection? Where was the complaint documentation? Where was the notice? Where was the approval? The answer to every question was the same. She didn't have one. Because there wasn't one. She had acted entirely on her own. From a legal perspective, the board knew exactly how dangerous that situation could become. If homeowners started believing HOA volunteers could enter garages whenever they felt suspicious, the association could face enormous problems. The board moved quickly. Denise received a formal reprimand. Any unofficial inspection privileges she claimed to have were immediately revoked. New procedures were announced to the entire neighborhood, clarifying exactly what HOA representatives could and could not do. The irony was beautiful. Denise had spent months trying to increase her influence. Instead, she ended up reducing it. Then came the social aftermath. News spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Within a week, everybody knew the story. People stopped talking about mysterious violations and started talking about the garage collection. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before asked if they could see some of the restoration projects. With permission, of course. Families came by. Kids loved the motorcycles. Older residents told stories about cars they remembered from their youth. What Denise intended as an act of intimidation accidentally turned into the best neighborhood icebreaker I'd ever had. Meanwhile, her reputation took a direct hit. People began questioning other complaints she'd made over the years. Not because they suddenly hated her, but because they realized she wasn't always operating from facts. Sometimes she was operating from assumptions. And assumptions are dangerous things, especially when they're mixed with authority. The final time I saw Denise near my property, she was walking down the sidewalk several weeks later. She glanced toward the garage, then quickly looked away and kept moving. No clipboard, no comments, no inspection, just silence. And honestly, that silence was worth more than any argument I could have won. A few months after everything happened, life in the neighborhood settled back into something resembling normal. The funny thing is that when you're living through a conflict like that, it feels enormous. Every phone call feels important, every conversation feels loaded with meaning, and every small interaction feels like part of some larger battle. Then time passes, people move on, lawns get mowed, kids ride their bikes through the streets again, and suddenly what felt like a crisis becomes a story people tell at block parties. For me, though, the whole experience left behind a few lessons that stuck around much longer than the drama itself. The first lesson here is that boundaries matter. Not just physical boundaries like fences, doors, and property lines, but personal boundaries too. A lot of people who overstep don't start with huge violations. They start with little ones. They test limits. They ask questions they shouldn't ask. They insert themselves into situations that don't involve them. If nobody pushes back, they often assume that means permission. Looking back, Denise's obsession with my garage didn't begin the day she walked inside. It began months earlier when she started treating curiosity as entitlement. The second lesson here is that assumptions are powerful and usually dangerous. Denise spent so much time convincing herself that something suspicious was happening that she stopped looking for facts. She started looking for confirmation. This is a psychological trap that catches a lot of people. Once somebody becomes emotionally invested in a particular conclusion, every piece of information gets filtered through that conclusion. Evidence that supports it gets magnified. Evidence that contradicts it gets ignored. That's exactly what happened here. She wasn't conducting an investigation. She was trying to prove a story she had already written in her head. And when reality didn't cooperate, everything fell apart. According to standard procedure, whether we're talking about HOAs, workplaces, schools, or even families, authority works best when it's paired with accountability. The moment somebody believes rules apply to everyone except themselves, problems usually follow. That's why procedures exist in the first place. They're not there to make life difficult. They're there to protect everyone involved. From a legal perspective, property rights are one of those subjects that seem boring until somebody ignores them. Then suddenly everybody becomes interested. The truth is that most HOA disputes aren't really about grass height, paint colors, or parking regulations. They're usually about power. They're about who gets to decide what's acceptable and who doesn't. In my case, the garage was never the real issue. The real issue was control. Denise wanted access to something she believed she was entitled to inspect. And when she discovered she wasn't entitled to it at all, the conflict finally exposed itself for what it really was. The part that still makes me laugh is how dramatically her plan backfired. She expected to uncover a scandal. Instead, she accidentally organized the world's most unexpected neighborhood museum tour. Some of the people I became closest friends with afterward were neighbors who first visited because they were curious about the collection. Kids who came to look at old motorcycles are teenagers now. Some of them still stop and ask questions about restoration projects when they see me working in the garage. That's probably my favorite outcome from the entire story. Something that started with suspicion ended with community. Something that began with conflict ended with conversations. And honestly, that's a much better ending than revenge. These days, the garage is still my favorite place in the house. The motorcycles are still there. The classic cars are still there. The collectibles are still there. The difference is that now I have better security cameras and stronger locks. Experience tends to teach practical lessons that way. But more importantly, I no longer worry about what people assume. If somebody wants to believe a story about me without evidence, that's their choice. Eventually, reality catches up. It usually does. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA Karen, an overly controlling neighbor, or someone who thought they had authority they didn't actually have? What would you have done if you came home and found someone inside your garage conducting an unauthorized inspection? Let me know in the comments, because stories like these always spark some wild discussions. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. The lesson here is that respect goes a lot further than control. Curiosity works better than assumptions, and entitlement tends to collapse the moment it collides with reality. Denise walked into my garage expecting to find a violation. What she found instead was 30 years of passion sitting under bright garage lights. And whether she realized it or not, that moment changed the entire neighborhood's perception of her forever.